Okay, we start a new unit now entitled When Emotions Rise. And so this is going to take us now for about six studies, 6 weeks. And all the 6 lessons are going to be coming from Psalms dealing with this new topic, when emotions rise. And I think one of the first things I'm going to point out for this whole unit is that emotions are real, but they also are fickle. We all know human nature is that our emotions can swing from one extreme to another. And but the solid part of all this is that God never changes. So our emotions will range. You know, there'll be a time when our feelings will take over and we don't feel like doing something. I mean, even there'll be points in our lives, and we all experienced it, when we don't feel like we're saved. But you know something, feelings ain't got nothing to do with salvation. It's all about facts and faith. And so God never changes. God's always there. He'll never leave us, forsake us. So I think one of the things we'll learn from this whole unit, this study, is that emotions are real, but they are fickle. They will change. And so don't put no stock in your feelings. All right, so this first lesson comes from Psalms 116, and it is from an anonymous writer. But I do believe there's enough evidence to show that Hezekiah may have written it. If so, he was king of Judah after Ahaz, his dad, about 687 BC to 715 BC. And Hezekiah was noted for bringing religious reform to Judah. His dad, Ahaz, was a wicked king, and he had allowed idols to actually come into the temple. And there was idols, places of idol worship all over the country. And so Hezekiah removed the idols from the temple and mostly into the country, but not all of them. And so that's a little bit about Hezekiah. I'll reference him more because I do believe he wrote the psalm. But this psalm could be summed up as a psalm of thanksgiving on deliverance from an imminent peril. And so there was a time, if Hezekiah wrote it, and I'm going to reference it like that because it still makes a good illustration. At the time of Hezekiah's reign, Assyria was a constant threat. And so they were always threatening, but they never did conquer Jerusalem under Hezekiah's, while he was king of Judah. But we also know in Isaiah, and I'll reference that some more too, that Hezekiah got sick, and he thought he was going to die. But God intervened and showed mercy, and he extended his life. But we'll have more to say about that. But let's begin with Psalm 116, verses 1 and 2 to begin with. I love the Lord because he has heard my voice and my supplications, because he has inclined his ear to me. Therefore I will call upon him as long as I live. So the psalmist says, I love the Lord. And why? Well, because God always heard my prayers, and he answered my prayers. So that's what Hezekiah, or the writer of Psalms, is saying here, is that God always heard and God always answered. Now let's remember now, in this case, God answered his prayer in the affirmative. Like, I'm dying, Lord, will you heal me? And God said, yes, I will, and extended Hezekiah's life. Well, God don't always say yes. No is an answer. And so let's keep that in mind. God hears your prayers and he does answer them. Wait, by the way, is also an answer. And so he says God heard his cry for mercy. And we know that from studying Isaiah that around 700 BC, Hezekiah was near death. And you can read about that in Isaiah chapter 38. And so he implores God to extend his life, and God did. He gave him about 15 more years. And so this psalm is a lot about a public thanks for what God has done for him. And so he's publicly thanking God. He is grateful. And I'm going to refer to that word often during the lesson today, being grateful. He was grateful and he was thankful for what God has done for him, and he was doing it publicly. And so that's pretty good advice for us to publicly acknowledge We can do this when we're eating out at restaurants, where we can show publicly that we're thanking God for our meals. And it's a good witness and it's a good testimony. So that's still good advice. Publicly thanking God for what He's done. Showing that you are grateful. Verse 2 reiterates what verse 1 said. Because He has inclined His ear to me. So this expression is very similar to what Hezekiah said in Isaiah chapter 37. So basically the psalm is saying this: God has never failed to hear me or answer my prayers. And because of this, I will promise to be grateful. I'll promise to be thankful and to praise His name for it. So 2 observations on that here. Where else in the Bible, particularly the New Testament, do we find similar verbiage about loving God? Obviously, 1 John 4:17 says, we love Him because He first loved us. And so, we didn't love Him first. He loved us first. And He demonstrated that. Because God said that He sent His Son while we were still enemies of His, while we were yet sinners, or still sinners, that Christ died for us. So, even before we knew God, He died for us, whether we accepted His offer of salvation or not. And many people, of course, didn't. But He died for them anyway. And so people will go to hell, but they'll go there loved, and they will go there having a choice too. But anyway, the Bible says that He loved us first. And so our gratitude, being thankful, is that we love Him too. And show it. Now verse 3. The pains of death encompassed me, the pains of Sheol laid hold of me, I found trouble and sorrow. So if Hezekiah is the writer, what he's referring to is that he said that the cords of death, or the pains of death, and the distress of that pain was a hell to me, is what he's saying. And it had laid hold of me, or it had bound me. And so death is pictured here then as seizing the victim and binding the victim with cords. And so now we see more of the reason for this gratitude because it graphically sets forth in the language here that the psalmist is describing as a great peril. I mean, he is in grief, he is in sorrow because he's about to die. So the Hebrew language here paints a picture of hunters actually lying in wait with cords to entangle the godly. And boy, that we can certainly relate to that. So what we have here is a man, a psalmist, I think, Hezekiah. He's in great distress, and he says he has overcome. He's overcome by trouble and sorrow and grief, and life had become a living hell to him, and we certainly can relate to that. So how many stories then have been told by countless millions of people of their story of tragedy, sorrow, and grief? And the Bible warns us that life will be like that. That we're going to have tribulation. I always thought what Dr. David Jeremiah said, that you either in a trial, you've been in one, or there's one coming. And so I think that's exactly right. And we're going to experience sorrow and grief in our lives. And everybody's got their story. But the Bible also promises that He'll never leave us and that God will never forsake us. And see, here's where we need to take hold of that promise and don't let our emotions rise or fall one extreme to the other. God promised He'd never leave us or forsake us. And we get into this emotional state, we think everybody's abandoned us, that everybody has turned their back on us, that we're all alone. Well, that is a feeling, that's an emotion that's not accurate. Emotions are fickle. They will fool you. Like I said earlier, sometimes you will feel like you ain't saved. But feelings ain't got nothing to do with salvation. And feelings don't have anything to do with God's promises. God said, I'll be there. I will hear your prayer. I will answer your prayer. That is a promise. And so we don't let our emotions then get away from us. He'll never leave us, never forsake us. And we are as close to God as our prayers. He will hear, He will answer, and He will comfort. And oh, the fellowship and the comfort of the Holy Spirit. Now look at verse 4. I call upon the name of the Lord. O Lord, I implore you, deliver my soul. All right, the psalmist knows he's in trouble, and in this case, maybe Hezekiah and on his deathbed, and the writer's in this terrible situation, and he resorts to what he says is his only hope, and that's God. Well, if you're on your deathbed and the doctors have already said, nothing else we can do for you, you exhausted that earthly source, God's still your hope. God may heal, God may not. I'm not in the position of God, I don't know that. But He'll get the glory out of it. It'll be His will. He called upon God. And so he called upon God's name. And so here's what Hezekiah, or the writer, is saying. The name of the Lord is signifying everything that a human needs in life and in death. We've already established the fact that tribulations are going to come. And people are going to die. I'm going to die. We've all experienced that is the truth, right? It is appointed unto man wants to die. There's going to be grief. But the Lord has promised to be the God of those who call upon Him. Now it does say, call upon Him. I mean, you don't want to go through no grief or sorrow or trial or tribulation and leave God out of it. God said, call on Him. I'll hear. I'll answer. And He will deliver His children in our time of sorrow and distress and grief. Now, deliverance is up to God, not up to us. All right? I can't help but think of them three Hebrew boys. I always liked me some Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were going to be thrown in the fire because they didn't bow down to King Nebuchadnezzar. And King Nebuchadnezzar was the most powerful person on the earth at that time. And he said, I'm throwing you in the fire if you don't bow down. And they said, well, we ain't bowing down. God, our God, who we serve, can either save us from the fire or from your hand. He can save us in the fire, through the fire, or we may die in that fire. But it's not going to matter because God's going to be with us. Now, the reason them boys could say something that brash is because they knew God. And listen, that's the same God, the three Hebrew boys, the same God that we have today. We can face our trials, and our sorrows, and our grief with the same kind of confidence and comfort because we know God. And whatever trial, tribulation, whatever grief comes about, we know God. We'll have that comfort, that support. So, it didn't bother those three Hebrew boys because they knew God. Now, verses 5 and 6. Gracious is the Lord and righteous, yes, our God is merciful. The Lord preserves the simple. I was brought low, and He saved me. When God answers prayer, He shows us His mercy, His grace, and His righteousness. All right? So He's gracious because it is of His mercy that He listens to us. I've often said that God should have zapped me a long time ago, but God is merciful. He is merciful. He is full of mercy. And it goes on and on and on. God is compassionate. And boy, aren't we glad. And He's also, when God answers prayer, He not only shows us His grace and His mercy, but He shows us His righteousness. Because having promised to hear our prayers, He's bound to keep that promise. And so He is righteous in that. So verse 6 tells us that God preserves the simple. So we're not talking about somebody that's of poor or low intelligence. What he's talking about here is that someone that's without guile. Okay? There's no guile in their life. And so here's the point I want to make about that. In our time of sorrow, grief, trial, tribulation, and we go to God in prayer, asking for that mercy, and we're harboring some kind of sin in our life, best prayer to be get right with God first. That'll be the prayer you need to pray there. And then be praying about your situation. But the Bible said here, the point to make here is that if you're harboring guile in your life or some sin in your life, God's not listening till you get right with Him. All right? So pray that prayer first. All right, and then he says that phrase, I was brought low. And so that's an expression of extreme weakness or plain exhaustion. So here's Hezekiah, in my mind, the writer of the psalm. He's on his deathbed, and he is out of options. I'm sure the doctors of that day done all they could do. Isaiah the prophet's already said, you need to get ready to die. And there he was at his rope's end, right? And so he was in extreme weakness, probably physically, mentally, emotionally. He was just plain exhausted. But the psalmist is saying that he is grateful because the Lord is reliable. God's faithful. Don't ever have to worry about God being unfaithful. God's going to do His part. God said, I'll never leave you. I'll never forsake you. That's a promise. That is a good promise to never, ever forget. Even when your emotions rise up or fall down, your feelings go one extreme to the other. He is faithful. And He encourages all the godly, all His children, to call upon Him during times of tribulation. Now verse 7. Return to your rest, O my soul, for the Lord has dealt bountifully with you. So what he's saying here is that he could return to a state of tranquility, or the condition in which he was before he got in this grief or whatever showed up. So also implied here, though, is that we can be at rest no matter what the tribulation is. Our joy never depends on our circumstances. What was it that Paul was writing? He was in jail, right? He was probably shackled, in chains, in a dungeon, starved to death. And he's writing letters to Colossians or Philippians. And he was saying, I count it all joy. And so many times now I've made this point in that here's Paul, he's in prison, chained, starving, cold, and he's writing that I count it all joy. And so we have to ask ourselves, what does it take to rob us of our joy? And the answer to that is a lot of times not much, right? Now, look at verse 8 and 9 now. For you have delivered my soul from death, my eyes from tears, and my feet from falling. I will walk before the Lord in the land of the living. Okay. Verse 8 relates back to verse 4. It said, deliver my soul. So if this is Hezekiah writing this psalm, then he would be talking about God delivering him from death and granting him 15 more years. And it says, mine eyes from tears. Isaiah 38:3 says that Hezekiah wept sore, bitterly, when he was told that he should prepare for his death. And so this is some of the support then for Hezekiah having written this. And he also makes a reference, my feet from falling. So here's what's going on there. Here's what this is. When we get into a time of distress, grief, sorrow, a trial, and we're experiencing great trouble, great grief, there's always a danger of our foot slipping or us falling into rebellion, into disobedience, or falling into being ungrateful. And if we're complaining all the time, there's nothing to be thankful or grateful for, and you're complaining all the time, you're not grateful. I'm sorry, that's just the way it is. Complaining and bellyaching all the time is coming from an ungrateful heart. Now, verse 9 is beautiful to me. Only the Lord can change death and tears, grief, trial, whatever, into a walk before the Lord and to a joyful celebration of life. He says that in the land of the living. Only God can do that. Only God can take lemons and make lemonade out of it. Only God can take a mess that we made and turn something out of it. Only God can take some sorrow or grief that we're experiencing and get the glory out of it. or bring something good out of it. God may be using our situation to help somebody else so that He gets the honor and glory for it. And you know, we ought to be grateful or thankful that God esteemed us worthy to be put in that situation. That's right. And you know, there's a lot of things just plain mystery. I mean, every time I read the book of Job, it's just plain mystery about that whole situation with Job. But God got the glory out of all that. So only God can take a trial, some sorrow or grief in your life, and bring good out of it. So we need to trust Him to do that. So keep your faith, hold on to your faith. Now, we skip down to verses 15 through 17. Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of His saints. O Lord, truly I am your servant. I am your servant, the son of your maidservant. You have loosed my bonds. I will offer to you the sacrifice of thanksgiving, and will call upon the name of the Lord. So verse 15 is teaching us that the death of His children, His saints, is a matter of deep concern to Him, but it's precious to Him. And so we don't, well, that don't sound like that goes together. Well, it does. And I've already mentioned that everybody knows we're going to die. It's appointed unto man who wants to die. And then after that is eternity. And eternity is going to be in a glorious place called heaven, or an awful place of judgment and torment called hell. And we're going to choose one way or the other. Verse 16 states, I am your servant. And so what the writer is saying here is, I'm entitled, therefore, to your care and comfort. Well, God's righteous. He made that promise, and He's going to keep His promise. And so the psalmist is saying once again that he is grateful and thankful that God has loosed His bonds. In other words, the cords of death He's talking about. That reference back in verse 3. And verse 17 speaks of a sacrifice of thanksgiving. Now, this is not an actual animal sacrifice, but a thanksgiving from a sincere heart, which is the best sacrifice. Remember what King David said after his ordeal? That God didn't want a sacrifice, He wanted a pure heart. Otherwise, he'd said, if God wanted a bull, I'd go find a bull and sacrifice him. But what God wants is a pure heart. That's the best sacrifice. Also, verse 17 again repeats the phrase, I will call upon the name of the Lord. I've already mentioned this, but this is signifying that God is everything that a human needs in life and in death. He's all we will ever need. And when we learn that He's all we got, then we know that He's all we need, or vice versa. All right? Now, I want to make some applications here. Point number 1. Verse 1 says, do you love the Lord? Well, the writer says, I love the Lord. And so my question from the Sunday school lesson today is, do you love the Lord? Do I love the Lord? And so it's a question that deserves an honest answer, isn't it? And so if the answer is yes, I love the Lord, then you need to be prepared to answer this question. Is it showing? Does it show up? Because God certainly showed us, right? God demonstrated His love to us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. So God showed us how much He loved us. I mean, we're eternally saved from a hell, right? I mean, shouldn't we love Him? Shouldn't we be grateful? Absolutely. And so the question here is, does it show? God demonstrated His love for us, and so I think it's entirely appropriate. It's our reasonable service that we show Him our love. And how do we do that? Being obedient. Whatever that call is on your life, be obedient. And so God has done for us in the past, He's doing for us now, and He's going to do for us into the future. And something else, God has done good. He's been merciful to our loved ones too. I've often thought that you get a new neighbor, somebody new comes to the church, and here's a family, and you be kind to their children, you've been kind to them too. And so the point here is that God has shown kindness to your loved ones too. And so anytime we do anything for somebody else, we've done it unto God. And so the connection is that what He's done, He's also done for our loved ones too. We'll be grateful. So, what have we done for Him? Do you love Him? Does it show? Are you obedient? Are you doing the will of the Father? Point number 2, this word grateful. I know I mentioned it several times, but this word has come up and been implied several times here in these verses. The psalmist was grateful that the cords of death had been loosed. He had been granted more time, right? He was healed from his sickness. And so he was grateful for God having done that. And it's showing up in his public demonstration of his service and publicly announcing it, right? You know, the Thanksgiving holiday has just passed, and we say that we're grateful, that we're thankful. Pray that same prayer at our dinner table at home, and we're grateful and thankful for a lot of things. But here's the big thing. Here's the take home, the message. Do we act like it? Do we act like it? And so I want to get this down on to like a human level between family and friends, and particularly maybe family. Do you show others that you're grateful? And particularly maybe at this point in my life, you know, I'm 60-something. I've got grown children. I've got grandchildren. And so I'm talking to children here, adult children. Are you grateful? Are you grateful? You know, let me say it this way. You pray prayers like, Lord, I'm so thankful for my husband, my wife, my children, yada, yada, yada. We go on and on about how grateful we are. And then immediately when you get through praying, you start complaining about your spouse or your children or things at work. And nothing's ever good. And you're always complaining. You're not grateful. Complaining comes from an ungrateful heart. All right? And that's just plain and simple there. So the take home is if you're being, say, disrespectful and rude to your parents or to family or friends, and then you're praying that, Lord, I'm thankful, and then you're disrespectful and rude, you're ungrateful. That's just plain of it. All right. Verse 7, let me make a comment about that, says that God has dealt bountifully with you. In other words, He's done a lot, right? Listen, our next breath of air is in His hand. God has dealt bountifully. And so, once again, are you grateful? Do you show it? Point number 3, distress. The psalmist was distressed or grieved over his sickness. And experience teaches us that distress, sorrow, grief is going to come. And it can come in many ways. And here's a few. Deep conviction of sin will bring sorrow and grief. Backsliding on God will do it. Doubt. One of Satan's best tools, or most used tools, is to create doubt in people's mind. Because if he can get you to doubt, he's got you defeated. Now listen, doubt is just plain sinful. That's right. Doubt is just plain sinful. God has made some promises, and He will keep them. The problem is always our doubt or our disbelief, and that's just plain sinful. And then, of course, natural death, sicknesses, and those kind of things. But no matter the cause, the deliverance is always the same. Call upon the name of the Lord, and He will return you to your rest. Point number 4. Death, verse 15 says, precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of His saints. Death is the moment that we meet God. And we either going to meet Him righteous or unrighteous. All right? And so death is God's angel gathering His loved one into the eternal sheepfold. And that's going to be far, far better. You know, that's what Paul told us in the New Testament. Now here's the point I want to make about death. We should always think of our loved one as gone home to be with the Father and our Father. Then death should become precious to us just like it is precious to God. Because death is appointed unto man who wants to die. It's going to happen. And it is that step that we take where we're going to be with our true love and be in eternal fellowship